Hello, kitties. Welcome back to another episode of The Dreaded Librarian. Today we'll be continuing our hell-raising series with the Hellbound Heart, Part 3. The seasons long for each other, like men and women, in order that they may be cured of their excesses. Spring, if it lingers more than a week beyond its span, starts to hunger for summer to end the days of perpetual promise. Summer, in its turn, soon begins to sweat for something to quench its heat. And the mellowest of autumns will tire of gentility at last, and ache for a quick, sharp frost to kill its fruitfulness. Even winter, the hardest season, the most implacable, dreams, as February creeps on, of the flame that will presently melt it away. Everything tires with time and starts to seek some opposition to save it from itself. So August gave way to September, and there were few complaints. With work, the house on Lodovico Street began to look more hospitable. There were even visits from neighbors, who, after sizing up the couple, spoke freely of how happy they were to have number 55 occupied again. Only one of them made any mention of Frank, referring in passing to the odd fellow who'd lived in the house for a few weeks the previous summer. There was a moment of embarrassment when Rory revealed the tenant to have been his brother, but it was soon glossed over by Julia, whose power to charm knew no bounds. Rory had seldom made mention of Frank during the years of his marriage to Julia, though he and his brother were only 18 months apart in age, and had, as children, been inseparable. This Julia had learned on an occasion of drunken reminiscing, a month or two before the wedding, when Rory had spoken at length about Frank. It had been melancholy talk. The brothers' paths had diverged considerably once they'd passed through adolescence, and Rory regretted it. Regretted still more the pain Frank's wild lifestyle had brought to their parents. It seemed that when Frank appeared, once in a blue moon, from whichever corner of the globe he was presently laying waste, he only brought grief. His tales of adventures in the shallows of criminality, his talk of whores and petty theft, all appalled their parents. But there had been worse, or so Rory had said. In his wilder moments, Frank had talked of a life lived in delirium, of an appetite for experience that conceded no moral imperative. Was it the tone of Rory's telling, a mixture of revulsion and envy, that had so piqued Julia's curiosity? Whatever the reason, she had been quickly seized by an unquenchable curiosity concerning this madman. Then, barely a fortnight before the wedding, the black sheep had appeared in the flesh. Things had gone well for him of late. He was wearing gold rings on his fingers, and his skin was tight and tanned. There was little outward sign of the monster Rory had described. Brother Frank was smooth as a polished stone. She had succumbed to his charm within hours. A strange time ensued. As the days crept toward the date of the wedding, she found herself thinking less and less of her husband-to-be, and more of his brother. They were not wholly dissimilar. A certain lilt in their voices, and their easy manner marked them as siblings. But to Rory's qualities, Frank brought something his brother would never have, a beautiful desperation. Perhaps what had happened next had been inevitable, and no matter how hard she'd fought her instincts, she would only have postponed the consummation of their feelings for each other. At least that was how she tried to excuse herself later. But when all the self-recrimination was done with, she still treasured the memory of their first and last encounter. Kirsty had been at the house, hadn't she, on some matrimonial business when Frank had arrived. But by that telepathy that comes with desire and fades with it, Julie had known that today was the day. She'd left Kirsty to her list-making or such-like, and taken Frank upstairs on the pretext of showing him the wedding dress. That was how she remembered it, that he'd asked to see the dress, and she'd put the veil on, laughing to think of herself in white, and then he'd been at her shoulder, lifting the veil, and she laughed on, laughed and laughed, as though to test the strength of his purpose. He had not been cooled by her mirth, however, nor had he wasted time with the niceties of a seduction. The smooth exterior gave way to cruder stuff almost immediately. Their coupling had had in every regard but the matter of her acquiescence all the aggression and the joylessness of rape. Memory sweetened events, of course, and in the 4 years and 5 months since that afternoon, she'd replayed the scene often. Now, in remembering it, the bruises were trophies of their passion, her tears proof positive of her feelings for him. The day following he disappeared, flitted off to Bangkok or Easter Island, some place where he had no debts to answer. She'd mourned him, couldn't help it, nor had her mourning gone unnoticed. Though it was never explicitly discussed, she had often wondered if the subsequent deterioration of her relationship with Rory had not started there, with her thinking of Frank as she made love to his brother. And now, despite the change of domestic interiors and the chance of a fresh start together, it seemed that events conspired to remind her again of Frank. It wasn't just the gossip of the neighbors that brought him to mind. One day, when she was alone in the house and unpacking various personal belongings, she came across several wallets of Rory's photographs. Many were relatively recent, pictures of the two of them together in Athens and Malta. But buried amongst the transparent smiles were some pictures she couldn't remember ever having seen before. Had Rory kept them from her? Family portraits that went back decades. A photograph of his parents on their wedding day, the black and white image eroded over the years to a series of grays. Pictures of christenings in which proud godparents cradled babies smothered in the family lace. And then, photographs of the brothers together, as toddlers with wide eyes, as surly school children snapped at gymnastic displays and in school pageants. Then, as the shyness of acne-ridden adolescence took over, the number of pictures dwindled until the frogs emerged as princes, the other side of puberty. Seeing Frank in brilliant color, clowning for the camera, she felt herself blushing. He had been an exhibitionist youth, predictably enough, always dressed à la mode. Rory, by comparison, looked dowdy. It seemed to her that the brothers' future lives were sketched in these early portraits. Frank, the smiling, seductive chameleon. Rory, the solid citizen. She had packed the pictures away at last and found, when she stood up, that with the blushes had come tears. Not of regret. She had no use for that. It was fury that made her eyes sting. Somehow, between one breath and the next, she'd lost herself. She knew, too, with perfect certainty when her grip had first faltered, lying on a bed of wedding lace, while Frank beset her neck with kisses. Once in a while she went up to the room with the sealed blinds. So far they'd done little decorating work on the upper floors, preferring to first organize the areas in public gaze. The room had therefore remained untouched, unentered, indeed, except for these few visits of hers. She wasn't sure why she went up, nor how to account for the odd assortment of feelings that beset her while there. But there was something about the dark interior that gave her comfort. It was a womb of sorts, a dead woman's womb. Sometimes, when Rory was at work, she simply took herself up the stairs and sat in the stillness, thinking of nothing, or at least nothing she could put words to. These sojourns made her feel oddly guilty, and she tried to stay away from the room when Rory was around. But it wasn't always possible. Sometimes her feet took her there without instruction to do so. It happened thus that Saturday, the day of the blood. She had been watching Rory at work on the kitchen door, chiseling several layers of paint from around the hinges, when she seemed to hear the room call. Satisfied that he was thoroughly engrossed in his chores, she went upstairs. It was cooler than usual. She was glad of it. She put her hand to the wall and then transferred her chilled palm to her forehead. No use, she murmured to herself, picturing the man at work downstairs. She didn't love him, no more than he, beneath his infatuation with her face, loved her. He chiseled in a world of his own. She suffered here, far removed from him. A gust of wind caught the back door below. She heard it slam. Downstairs, the sound made Rory lose his concentration. The chisel jumped its groove and sliced deeply into the thumb of his left hand. He shouted as a gush of color came. The chisel hit the floor. "Hell and damnation!" She heard, but did nothing. Too late, she surfaced through a stupor of melancholy to realize that he was coming upstairs. Fumbling for the key and an excuse to justify her presence in the room, she stood up, but he was already at the door, crossing the threshold, rushing toward her, his right hand clamped ineptly around his left. Blood was coming in abundance. It welled up between his fingers and dribbled down his arm, dripping from his elbow, adding stain to stain on the bare boards. "What have you done?" she asked him. "What does it look like?" he said, through gritted teeth. "Cut myself." His face and neck had gone the color of window putty. She'd seen him like this before. He had on occasion passed out at the sight of his own blood. "Do something," he said queasily. "Is it deep?" "I don't know," he yelled at her. "I don't want to look." He was ridiculous, she thought, but this wasn't the time to give vent to the contempt she felt. Instead, she took his bloody hand in hers, and while he looked away, prized the palm from the cut. It was sizable and still bleeding profusely. Deep blood, dark blood. "I think we'd better take you up to the hospital," she told him. "Can you cover it up?" he asked, his voice devoid of anger now. "Sure, I'll get a clean binding. Come on." "No," he said, shaking his ashen face. "If I take a step, I'll pass out." "Stay here, then," she soothed him. "You'll be fine." Finding no bandages in the bathroom cabinet, the equal of the staunching, she fetched a few clean handkerchiefs from his drawer and went back into the room. He was leaning against the wall now, his skin glossy with sweat. He had patted in the blood he'd shed. She could taste the tang of it in the air. Still quietly reassuring him that he wouldn't die of a 2-inch cut, she wound a handkerchief around his hand, bound it on with a second, then escorted him, trembling like a leaf, down the stairs, one by one like a child, and out to the car. At the hospital they waited an hour in a queue of the walking wounded before he was finally seen and stitched up. It was difficult for her to know in retrospect what was more comical about the episode, his weakness or the extravagance of his subsequent gratitude. She told him, when he became fulsome, that she didn't want thanks from him, and it was true. She wanted nothing that he could offer her, except perhaps his absence. "Did you clean up the floor in the damp room?" she asked him the following day. They'd called it the damp room since that first Sunday, though there was not a sign of rot from ceiling to skirting board. Rory looked up from his magazine. Gray moons hung beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept well, so he'd said. A cut finger, and he had nightmares of mortality. She, on the other hand, had slept like a babe. "What did you say?" he asked her. "The floor," she said again. "There was blood on the floor. You cleaned it up." He shook his head. "No," he said simply, and returned to the magazine. "Well, I didn't," she said. He offered her an indulgent smile. "You're such a perfect housefrau," he said. "You don't even know when you're doing it." The subject was closed there. He was content, apparently, to believe that she was quietly losing her sanity. She, on the other hand, had the strangest sense that she was about to find it again. This has been part 3 of The Hellbound Heart. Thank you for watching The Dreaded Librarian. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and if you've got something you'd like me to read, comment below. Until next time, kiddies, sweet dreams.